I'm very honored to have a very special guest here at Pax Europiana, the show for peace in Europe. And we have Edward Lucas, who is a very famous journalist by himself already and a book author, and also senior fellow of the Center for European Policy Analysis. And he has worked in Central and Eastern Europe since '86 and was the senior editor of The Economist. He's an expert for all issues, Russia and Central and Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and also the author of The New Cold War. This is a very important book, a milestone in our understanding of our relation with Russia. And I'm very honored that you take the time, Edward. And I would like now to ask you to present yourself shortly to the audience. Welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much for having me on this podcast, and greetings wherever you're listening. I'm here in Southwest London, and I've been interested in this really since I was a small boy. I was fascinated by the idea that countries could disappear from the map, because if you come from Britain, Britain's pretty much looked the same since 1,000 years. We occasionally get a bit bigger or a bit smaller, but there's been something called England around since almost since the days of the Roman Empire. And so the idea that countries in the Balkans or the Baltics and elsewhere could be big one moment and small the next and then disappear, this was astonishing to me. And it's I think that's still the idea of the rise and fall of nations and of empires is still a very profound question. We see it both with Russia's attempt to recreate a kind of Russian empire, and also with China's attempt to create a sort of soft empire through infrastructure and control of the way we speak and publish and interact with each other. So these are old questions, but they always have new forms.
You're the author of this famous book, in a way iconic book, The New Cold War. Already in 2008 you published it. What was your insights already so early, before the Georgian War and the terrible things of 2008 in the summer? You were able to understand and assess very early the crisis we are in with this modern Russia. And can you explain a little bit what made you understand the situation so early?
Well, in a way, I wish I'd written the book earlier, although perhaps it wouldn't have been so easy to get it published. But I've been worried since the 1990s about several things. One was that Russia wasn't going in what one might call the right direction, wasn't turning into a law-governed democracy of the kind that was slowly and painfully taking shape elsewhere in the region. And instead, the old KGB hadn't really been got rid of, and we had new elements of the KGB allying with organized crime and with business and with government administration. And these features were already visible in the what we now regard as the sort of quite friendly 1990s. But I was worried even then. I was living in the Baltic states, and I could see how Russia had what we now call hybrid warfare tactics, the use of money and propaganda and energy blackmail and other sort of subversion active measures against the Baltic states. And I could see that this was not going to get better and would eventually affect other countries too. And I saw how the Baltic states and Ukrainians and others were warning the West, even in the 1990s, watch out. And that people giving those warnings were being ignored or patronized and belittled and told you're pretending as if your hair's on fire and don't exaggerate. So I came into the Putin era already quite worried about Russia. And then when I saw under Putin intensified this, both his attempt to kind of persuade the West that everything was now friendly, and his charm offensive to the Germans, to Gerhard Schröder, to Tony Blair, to the Bush administration, his cooperation with the war on terror, particularly with Afghanistan. I was very worried by that. And then I was worried by these very dramatic things we saw: the assassination of Anna Politkovskaya, the really, what by today's standards is quite mild, but by previous standards was quite startling descent into repression in Russia. The cyber attack on Estonia, the Bronze Soldier attack, and the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko. And I felt these were like alarm bells ringing, and why was no one noticing? So in 2007, early 2007, I pitched the book to a publisher, and I wrote it in the summer of 2007. And one of my messages was, watch out, there's going to be a war in Georgia. And I was vindicated on that. Another message, which remains very true to this day, I think, is to warn about the weakness of the West when it comes to money. And I put it like this: if you think that only money matters, then you're defenseless when people attack you using money. And this has become a big theme of everything I've done since, the idea that democracy is vulnerable to dirty money in the hands of hostile, of adversaries and hostile nation states.
There was then this terrible year of first 2008, then came the Obama reset, and then in 2014 came the shocking events of the Crimean annexation, the start of the Donbass war. And how did you experience, and did you feel vindicated by this aggression of Russia? And what is the feeling when you say it and then something terrible happens? And please, can you elaborate on the year 2014?
Yeah, well, in a way, I wouldn't say I felt relief, but there'd been a period under Medvedev and the reset when things seemed to be superficially going in a different direction. And although I tried to be quite optimistic about the reset, and I thought it was a defensible diplomatic gimmick to try and make the most of whatever changes were happening in Russia, I quite quickly became quite cross that the victims of the reset were the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, who were having their arms twisted to get with the program. And I still remain cross with the Obama administration and the people in it for that. And I think they haven't perhaps paid the price in criticism they should have paid. And the attack on Ukraine in 2014 did finally get the West to start taking things seriously. We'd seen a bit in terms of NATO making contingency plans for the Baltic states. That was a good thing the Obama administration did, but they were pretty sketchy plans. They weren't really, and they were the sort of minimum that we could do rather than anything that was effective. So that changed after 2014, and we had a serious NATO presence, which is continuing to get more serious in the Baltic and also in the Black Sea, with plenty still to do, but it's going in the right direction. I think I also feel vindicated very much on the energy security side, that back in the early 2000s, I remember going to the I think it was the German energy ministry and saying you need to watch out because your gas dependency on Russia, and being told, Herr Lucas, are you seriously telling us that Russia would use energy as a weapon? I think a little bit later on in the Kanzleramt, I had someone saying, are you seriously saying that, Herr Lucas, that Russia would use information as a weapon? And we've seen both of these, and with information, we're still playing catch up, but with the energy, it's been transformed really, although Russia built Nord Stream 2, and we have the European Commission really getting to grips with Russia on the monopolistic, abusive, corrupt framework with which Russia was exporting gas. We've seen the effective the prosecution of Russia for market abuse. We've also seen lots of infrastructure being built. And this meant that when the war in Ukraine came, we had already taken quite a lot of the measures that we needed to be a bit more economically resilient. But I still feel really angry that Ukrainians have died in their thousands and had their lives ruined in their tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands because the West got it wrong. If we had listened earlier, these people would be alive and their lives wouldn't be ruined and Crimea wouldn't be occupied and Eastern Ukraine wouldn't be the site of a war. And I think that the West has taken the most expensive postgraduate course in geopolitics in the history of the world, and other people have paid for it.
How do you see the next steps in our relation with Russia? We have a new American president. We have some German, French efforts for appeasement and for kind of a common meeting, EU, Russia. How do you see, will we have a kind of a better face with Russia, or is this confrontation continuing?
Well, I feel this Bob Dylan song, When Will They Ever Learn, should be playing in the background. And it really just is astonishing to me that that particularly President Macron, whose own election campaign, let us not forget, was hacked by the Russians, who tried to leak it in a way that would be damaging for him, and who started off as an admirably hawkish Russia approach to Russia, that he's still doing this and playing these silly games which go over the heads of the East Europeans. Now, if there was a way to have better relations with Russia on climate change, for example, or on the management of space or nuclear weapon arms control, or any other kind of arms control. I'd be in favor of that. I'm not in favor of putting Russia in a complete deep freeze. I grew up during the Cold War. We talked to Brezhnev's Soviet Union about important issues. And if we do that, we can certainly talk to Russia. And we should remember we're talking from a position of strength. We are the EU is a $20 trillion GDP and 450 million people. Put that together with Britain and the United States and the other Western countries, and we are a $40 trillion dollar economy with 1 billion people, and Russia is the size of Italy in economic terms and has 140 million people. So we are in a strong position of strength, and I think from that position of strength we can absolutely talk to the Russians on all sorts of things. But what doesn't make sense is for individual countries to try and do their own deals, because if you deal with Russia on a bilateral basis, Russia will be the stronger party for almost every country except the United States. And that just doesn't make sense. And yet we're doing it again. And I feel very frustrated by this. The EU should take a common line, strong common line on Russia, and the West should take a strong common line on Russia, and then we'd get somewhere.
How about NATO and EU accession of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova? Unfortunately, we are a bit stuck here. And do you think this would be the right way to put them firmly on a EU and NATO accession trajectory?
Well, I was strongly in favor at the time, and I think that we should have, right back in the 1990s, we should have said all these countries have membership action plans with very clear public criteria, and when you meet these criteria, you will join NATO. And then it would have been much harder for Russia to turn it into a political question involving Russia, because this doesn't involve Russia. This is about these countries and their progress towards NATO standards and their willingness to be part of the world's most successful defensive military alliance. But we've mishandled it so much now that I wonder if NATO is ever going to be in a position to take that decision. It has divisions within NATO, and so I worry that train has left now, and I note with alarm the way in which NATO, Georgia particularly, is moving away from the West, and Ukraine is beginning to think differently. We see Ukraine saying nice things about China and saying that its main strategic partner is Turkey. And we've taken these countries for granted for a long time and have made them sit and sit and sit and sit in the waiting room. And the result is they're getting impatient, and our offer looks stale. And so I still strongly believe we should support Ukraine. We should sell Ukraine weapons. We should give Ukraine free trade, much deeper and more comprehensive free trade with the European Union. We should be investing in Ukrainian public services and infrastructure and bring Ukraine into the 3 Cs initiative. And there's a long shopping list of things we can do. I'm worried that the NATO question is now receding into the far distance, and that's bad for Ukraine. It's bad for us.
In the first Cold War, it was even possible to integrate Western Germany fully in NATO in 1955. And it was much more controversial and crisis times in 55. Why not to have Ukraine as well without the occupied territories in NATO and see for the future?
Well, indeed. I mean, NATO was very flexible in the past. We also had countries that weren't democracies, Spain, Portugal, or Turkey at least, and Greece under the colonels. And so, I mean, in the end, NATO is a mixture of idealism and realpolitik. And when we were facing the existential threat from the Soviet Union, we were able to do things that we now think are difficult. And I disagree with that. I also feel that NATO should be much bolder when it comes to China. If we want the Americans to stay in Europe, we have to give the Americans much more help on dealing with China. And I would like to see a NATO naval presence in the South China Sea on a permanent basis, not a visiting basis. And we should be saying to the Americans, how can we help? We are your best and biggest allies. You have a serious problem here. We want to help you. That would have been far more useful than wasting trillions of dollars and thousands of lives in these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which have brought nobody any long-lasting benefits, as far as I can see.
About Nord Stream 2 and the German elections now coming up in September, do you think, and also the Americans now having waived their sanctions, what's your opinion on Nord Stream 2? Can it be still stopped, and should it be stopped by the Germans?
I think, again, it's very late. This is the house is not just on fire, but is almost burnt to the ground, and we're still asking whether we should be calling the fire engine. I think that this administration has decided to prioritize relations with Germany over the interests of other countries, and that sends a very bad message. It sends a very bad message to the Poles and the Ukrainians and the Baltic states about America's priorities. It also sends a bad message to Germany, which says we will indulge you in your bad behavior. And this is actually not good for Germany, because this pipeline doesn't just export gas, it exports corruption and influence. And there's already far too much Russian money and influence and pressure in German politics. We don't want more of it. It also undermines the politicians in Germany who've been campaigning against Nord Stream and saying this is going to do terrible damage to our relations with America. And then America turns around and says, well, actually, you know what, it's almost built now, so let's forget it. I think that the best way forward now probably is to exert a very heavy price in exchange for its completion. So to have a legal commitment to buy gas via Ukraine, to make sure the gas that comes through both Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 is subject to the strictest interpretation of the EU single market in gas, so no destination clauses or anything like that, and to ensure that the EU invests heavily further in the gas infrastructure in Eastern Europe, with more LNG terminals, completing the interconnectors, developing other resources. But I also think it's worth remembering that we are moving away from gas in Europe. We need to move towards the hydrogen economy and towards renewables and towards other forms of energy. So the faster we do that, the more irrelevant Russia's energy influence on us will seem. So if I could, I would stop it at once. I'd rip it up and sell the pipes somewhere else. But I think more realistically, we should just exert a very heavy price for its completion. And maybe the new German government, the next German government will do that.
Edward, with the Americans being so lenient with the Germans now on the energy question, could the Germans not exert the influence in the European Union to get Ukraine at least the EU potential candidate status together with EPA funding, which would make Ukraine much faster reforming and much better for everybody?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is basically the bargain. I think with the Germans should be told, if you're going to get your gas, you have to help Ukraine, and pushing for Ukraine's membership perspective in the EU would be a fantastic idea. I'd be strongly support that.
Let me ask you about EU-NATO relation, because there was some progress in recent weeks and months with Mr. Stoltenberg and Mrs. van der Leyen being quite close and having mutual invitations. Do you think that is also an important aspect of our future EU-NATO relations, to be working much more closer in the European continent?
Well, I'm delighted they are working more closely together. And I remember an era when they almost couldn't be in the same room because of, everything was held up by Turkey's objection to Greece and the EU behavior on Cyprus. And it was a really serious obstacle, and we've overcome that, and so the bureaucratic relations are quite good. I'm still waiting for substance, and so we need the main thing the EU can do is military mobility. That's what NATO needs. We don't need another headquarters. We don't, and most of the stuff that Europe promises to spend money on the military side is effectively useless or duplication. I don't see any great benefit there. The one thing that we really want is the infrastructure and bureaucratic procedures to be improved so that we can move troops as quickly across Europe as Russia moves them across Russia. And we need to know that if heavy armor is leaving Britain on day one, that it can be in Poland on day 3, not week 3. And this is still really bad. And I'm waiting for progress on this, and Germany is meant to be in charge of this and has the JSEC headquarters at Ulm, and this is great because Germany is the big sort of obstacle to military mobility at the moment, but where's the improvement? So I'm delighted. It's a bit like if your children have agreed to start doing their homework, that's great, but they actually have to sit down and complete it. And I'm waiting very impatiently, and we will see with Zapad this year, which has already started, but when it culminates in September, that Russia has yet again improved its already really impressive abilities to move huge quantities of troops and equipment really, really fast over really long distances, really efficiently. And we can't do that. And that is a serious strategic imbalance in the East.
Especially if Germany is not spending 2% in defense, at least they could spend significantly more on Eastern European infrastructure support via the EU.
Well, I would say to the Germans, don't, rather than spending your not 2% on trying to catch up on things that are going to take decades, let's at least focus. I mean, I would recategorize the NATO target to include spending on dual use civil and military infrastructure. And so if the Germans put money into improving the railway network in a way that means you have spare wagons for moving tanks, you've raised the bridges to the height to get the most modern tanks underneath, that you have extra port capacity at Bremerhaven, you have and also the ability to use capacity at short notice, which is inconvenient. I mean, Germans don't like it if they're told you can't use this road because there's a Dutch troop convoy going down it, and if BMW or Audi can't use the railways because we're sending tanks over the railways, this comes at a price, and you have to put that price into the equation. But then you have to pay it. And you're absolutely right. I think that this should probably be Germany's number one priority, really, because it's a force multiplier. If you can get American and French and Dutch and British troops quickly to Eastern Europe, that makes up for the fact that the German tanks only have broomsticks instead of guns because they've underspent for so long.
Let me ask you about the EU-NATO relations. We have 6 neutral countries in the European Union, and I would like to ask you for each of them and why you think they are not in NATO and if they should join NATO. Let me start first with Ireland. Why is Ireland not in NATO, and do you think it would be good for Ireland to join NATO?
Well, Ireland is not in NATO for historical reasons to do with its relations with Britain. And there is a sort of left-wing anti-American streak in Irish politics, which continues to take that view. In fact, Ireland is effectively in NATO because it has air defences that are entirely integrated. The British planes are actually defending the Irish airspace, and it's a bit of a free rider in that respect. So I think it would be, and I mean, Ireland has an extremely small and very lightly equipped army that is really only involved in peacekeeping. It wouldn't be a serious, wouldn't make a serious difference. And I think it would be nice if it joined, but I wouldn't expend a great deal of political capital on something that is essentially symbolic. We just accept, we defend, Britain defends Ireland, and I mean, because we can't afford to have the idea to have Russian warplanes crossing Irish airspace and then getting into our airspace. So I think we could probably do a little bit more. But I talking to British and NATO planners, I don't get the impression that Ireland is a great priority.
What about Malta to join NATO?
Again, there's a streak of anti-Americanism there. I think it could be quite useful. And again, when I talk to naval people, I don't think that there's a huge, it's not a huge issue. We have the Mediterranean pretty well covered when it comes to advanced naval warfare operates against quite long distances already. So it's not like World War II, where Malta was a tremendously important port. The combination of what we've got in Greece and what we've got in Spain and in Italy, I think covers the Mediterranean quite well, and we don't find the Russian naval presence there a great threat.
And Cyprus joining NATO?
Well, I'm more worried on Cyprus on the in economic security and as a source of Russian organized crime and money laundering and espionage. And we have British bases in Cyprus, so we have the infrastructure there that NATO needs if it ever needs it. But I worry a lot about this other stuff, and I would be happy to apply more pressure to Cyprus. They've been exceptionally unhelpful on some issues to do with economic intelligence and financial crime.
And Austria, please.
Austria is again is a free rider, and it's mainly a problem in intelligence terms. That the Vienna is a sort of espionage capital, and there are Russian spies, actually Chinese spies as well, based in Vienna, who conduct intelligence operations in the NATO countries roundabout. And I would be in favour of highlighting to the Austrian authorities the costs they impose on their allies from this and trying to get more cooperation. But from a military point of view, Austria is not terribly important. It's not a frontline. It's not a frontline state in geographical terms, and where it is a frontline state in terms of finance, intelligence, and organized crime, NATO isn't really the answer. So I wouldn't prioritize that.
The United Kingdom is the guarantee power of our Austrian State Treaty of 55, and still we are not in NATO. And we are often very misbehaving towards Western interests in many ways, like money laundering, secret service problems we have recently with Russia, and so on and so on. Okay, anyhow, let's talk about Finland next. Finland, NATO.
Well, I think Finland and Sweden I put in a very similar category, that they are actually better NATO members than many countries that are in the alliance. And we have a lot to learn from them. In terms of Finnish total defense, particularly, is a really admirable model, and everyone should be trying to copy it. But this I wrote a big report on this subject 6 years ago, and I argued then against fetishizing NATO membership, but instead concentrating on practical cooperation. And I think that judgment was vindicated. We have now seen a big increase in defense spending in Sweden, some increase in Finland. Those two countries cooperate with each other in an unprecedentedly close way, particularly in air and sea operations. They also cooperate very closely with Norway. There's a trilateral cooperation, which is extremely important and very close and not well known. They also cooperate on a bilateral basis with the United States and on a trilateral basis with the United States. So I think what we are seeing taking shape in Northern Europe is kind of Nordic mini NATO based on the very advanced military capabilities of these countries. Not least in aviation, but also in intelligence and so on, coupled with the military mass of the United States. And they're also members of the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is Britain's sort of the British-led mini NATO for Northern Europe. So I see plenty. I mean, there's still plenty to do, but I think that the problems caused by their not being NATO are increasingly unimportant compared with the importance of the cooperation that we already have. Public opinion in both countries is moving towards joining NATO, but I think bringing up the NATO question now would be divisive and a distraction. So I prefer to spend my political capital on improving defense rather than trying to get the NATO question over the line. I think it will happen, but I'm also worried that it should happen with both countries together. And what I absolutely don't want is a Swedish government that says join NATO when Finland isn't ready, because it would be very destabilizing to have Sweden in NATO and Finland not in NATO. So if they do join, they should join together, and they've agreed that between themselves. But that should be a important consideration as well for outsiders.
How about the European Union itself joining NATO? Would that impress the Russians, and would it be meaningful?
Yes, I think it's a nice idea. I'm not quite sure how it would work, and whether I haven't heard this idea before. I mean, NATO is a collection of nations, and I don't know whether the EU as a supranational entity could join NATO. I think I would kick that off to the think tanks to have a look at, and I would also see what the political will in the EU is for that. I suspect you might find some opposition, but I don't know. I've not heard the idea before. I'll reflect on it and ask some questions.
One issue is now, with the British having left with Brexit, you want to have a free trade agreement with the United States. Yeah? And there is this big issue, the elephant in the room, about having TTIP with the EU and the US. Do you think there is a chance for having a trade agreement now, UK, US and EU, all free in some ways in this mandate, in order to show the economic might of the West and show more unity? Would that impress the Russians and the Chinese?
It would be a wonderful idea, and we're not doing it. I was a very strong opponent of Brexit, chiefly for security reasons. I thought the EU as a security actor was well worth staying in, much more than That was to me much more important than some of the other things. And I was a strong supporter of TTIP, and we dropped the ball on TTIP. The protectionist tide was running strongly in both, or the anti-globalization tide was running strongly on both sides of the Atlantic, and it was a great chance. And looking back, if we'd got TPP and TTIP both through with solid ratification and underpinning, we'd be in a much better state now particularly to confront China. And the transatlantic alliance basically needs to be a military alliance, and it's pretty against Russia, and it's pretty strong. There's more to be done, but I don't worry about it hugely. Whereas with China, what we need is a trans-Pacific and transatlantic economic unity on economic governance. We need to say this is 1 billion plus people. More if you include some of the other Pacific countries like Indonesia and Vietnam and so on, which really have big. If you said we make the rules on data, on technology, on AI, on carbon content of imports, that would be a really serious negotiating partner for the Chinese. And we could have done that. Nobody stopped us doing it. We were just lazy and complacent and short-sighted and greedy, and now it's late. And I don't think there's much. Trade deals are now very unpopular in America, and I've been trying to persuade the Democrats in Congress to look at this again, but they don't like it. And Biden wants a policy that's good for blue-collar America. So if it's going to be free trade, it's pretty weak. I think we maybe can redo it, start again on the more economic governance issues and regulation, things like that, and leave the sort of nitty-gritty questions of tariffs and quotas out of it. But we're starting from a bad place, and it's our fault.
Russia is an openly aggressive power in Central and Eastern Europe, but also China has increased its influence in economics and in infrastructure. What's your take on the Chinese role in Ukraine, in Serbia, in some of the other countries? Are you worried about this combination of Russian aggression and Chinese infrastructure and financial dominance in Eastern Europe?
Well, there's several questions here. One is, why are we looking at Eastern Europe, not Western Europe? I'm much more worried about Chinese influence in Germany, in France, in Britain, than I am in the East European countries, because in the so-called East European countries, there's a strong strategic culture. People worry about foreign influence operations, they're alert to them. And with a few exceptions, Serbia, Hungary, Belarus, particularly, I think that the Chinese are pushing against considerable resistance, and we can go into that in a bit more detail later. Whereas I don't feel that the big West European countries are aware of the Chinese threat. Then there's a second question: are Russia and China cooperating? I don't think so. They agree not to compete. They sometimes have areas, particularly in Central Asia, where there's clearly potential friction, but they don't have it. So there's a kind of they've decided to be friends and to settle their differences quietly and behind the scenes, and that's worked pretty well for the Chinese. It's not quite so good for the Russians, but the Russians have decided they're going to put up with that. But I wouldn't say they're strategic partners. I think there's a rhetorical level of cooperation, but it's very hard to find an area where you can say this is a Russian-Chinese joint operation. I would not be able to give I think any substantial example of that. Is the Chinese threat getting worse? Yes, it is. But the Chinese have run into some serious obstacles. They're not, they're putting more and more effort into Europe, but they're not getting more and more results.
So what is your take? What should we do as a West, as a united Western world, in order to contain aggressive Russia and China, communist China, in the coming decade?
The most important thing is to make our system work better. Most of the time, Russia and China succeed not because they're great, but because we've screwed up. So they feed on alienation in our political system, and the bottom fifth or bottom third of the population that say the economics and politics doesn't work for us, and we're keen to find anyone who's against them up there, D. Orban, as they say in Germany, will be our friend. So that and we can fix that. We let our politics decay. We let our economics be bad for the bottom slice of the economy of the population. We can build better infrastructure. If we were building a railway from Budapest to Piraeus via Belgrade, then no one would be asking about a Chinese one. The connectivity in the eastern half of Europe is the last legacy of the Berlin Wall. We have, whether it's roads, railways, pipelines, whatever. If you look at the map of Europe, you can see that there's a density of connectivity in the former capitalist West, which was still the capitalist West, but during the Cold War was the capitalist West, which isn't there in the former communist East. And we have had 30 years to fix this, and we've done a lot, but we haven't done enough. And that provides an opportunity for China with its offer of cheap, effective infrastructure. It's the same in Africa. If we were offering good economic conditions to African countries, then there wouldn't be room for the Chinese. Same in Asia, same all over the place. So in the end, it's a bit like if you have a house where the roof and windows leak. Sometimes you get snow and rain, and sometimes you get wind coming through. And you can complain about this, but fundamentally it's your fault that the roof and the windows leak. And this is what we're seeing with Russia and China. They exploit the gaps and weaknesses in our system, so we should fix them. And then we find life a great deal safer and better.
Will we rise to the challenge as a united West?
Well, and we're not a united West at the moment, but we need to be. And I think we're gradually, it's a bit like with climate change, we're moving in the right direction, but we've left it late. Because we left it late, it's more expensive and difficult, and there's a risk that we lose. And I think if we inherited a tremendous legacy of moral capital and geopolitical superiority in the 1990s when communism collapsed, and we could have said, right, we fixed that. Now, what do we need to? We fixed communism. Now we need to worry about global poverty, climate change. Fixing the weakness in corruption, organized crime, political alienation, superstition, these things. And we could have said, right, let's go on and do those next. And we didn't. We were incredibly self-indulgent. We allowed the financial system to let rip and enrich small numbers of people with this sort of casino capitalism. We let the sort of offshore finance industry run riot with offshore bank accounts and this whole sort of complete impenetrability of anonymous beneficial ownership and so on. We forgot about the bottom billion on the planet, and we said, hey, China, great, let's get rich, instead of saying China lies about its history. This regime has killed tens of millions of people. It's just killed another few tens of thousands in Tiananmen Square. So let's worry about China a lot. And we didn't. We said, hey, bring them into the World Trade Organization. They can make cheap stuff and we'll get rich with that. So we've made a lot of mistakes, and now we're waking up to it, and it's difficult. So I think it's well worth reflecting on what the world will look like if we lose, if we have a rules-led international order that's led by China, with China setting and enforcing the rules. I don't think we'll like that very much, particularly not you and me, I suspect, Gunter. So we've got to get, build political attention, build political willpower, effective implementation, start fixing stuff. And it's my job and yours as well to alert people to this and try and make things happen. And we are getting somewhere, but it's not nearly enough.
We won the first Cold War. Edward, will we win the second Cold War?
It's an open question, and we nearly didn't win the first Cold War. We nearly had nuclear accidents which have obliterated everybody, and we were much closer to that than we realized at the time. And communism did quite well in Europe in the 50s and 60s. There was some serious problems with NATO, and France pulled out of NATO. Other countries could have done. There were a lot of accidents along the way, and we in the end, I think it wasn't so much that we won, although we did win. It was more that communism lost. That communism was had two huge difficulties: that it killed tens of millions of people and led a miserable life for the people behind the Iron Curtain. It was a very hard sell, to say, hey, let's all live like people do in the Soviet Union, and that was increasingly clear. And secondly, the political decision-making in communism, under communism, was very bad, and you had very old, stupid, nasty people making very bad decisions, epitomized by Leonid Brezhnev. And so, they were victims of the way their own system worked, in terms of their image and in terms of the way they decided things. And I'm not sure we have those advantages now. That the Chinese system has huge problems: debt, environmental pollution, demographics, alienation. But it has strengths as well, and I don't think they're screwing up as much as we screw up. And so I worry. It's not. It's an open question. I think, on balance, we're more likely to win than to lose, but I can see a path in which we lose.
So now, Edward, please, an optimistic closing of this wonderful interview I need, because I really also want to win this second Cold War. What do we have to do in order to succeed?
Well, I would say very simple: fix our weaknesses and exploit our strengths. And we still have tremendous assets in our system, which we don't fully appreciate: the cultural freedoms, the creativity, the fact that life is basically pretty good, as nowhere else in the European Union treats its people better than anywhere else in the world. And we should really rejoice in the strengths of our system and sell it much harder abroad, and fix the weaknesses. We should also attack the weaknesses in their system, and I think we could still do a lot more to highlight the corruption and incompetence in the Russian and Chinese systems. And we could stop laundering the dirty money from these systems. Would be a really good first step, because it's one of the paradoxes of these people is that they steal money at home and then they invest it abroad in real estate in London and educating their children at Harvard. And they do this through anonymous shell companies with the help of our best bankers, lawyers, and accountants. And so, if we simply clean up the anonymity in the financial system and penalize the enablers, who are the sort of collaborators, they're the sort of financial and legal quislings of the modern era, that would already send a powerful moral signal, and that we're back in business as a moral entity, and it would be a very practical one. So I'm delighted that this administration is finally getting to grips with what they call threat finance or illicit finance. But we see even under the Trump administration there's progress, and now there's more. And I just gave evidence to Congress the other day on kleptocracy and how to deal with it. So I think the awareness is growing, and we have the tools. Everything we need to win is to hand. We don't have to invent new stuff. We just need to use the tools that we've got and use them decisively and effectively and bravely and morally, and then we can do it. So I'm still optimistic. I'm not quite 60, and I hope that by the time I finally hang up my laptop and sit back and watch the cricket, I'll be able to say that we've done this in maybe 20 years' time. I hope to raise a glass of beer with you, Gunter, to celebrate our victory. If not, we'll both be in some gulag in China.
I hope the moment when you close your laptop is a long time in the future, because we need you, Edward. You are amazing, really the hero of everybody who is worried about Russia and China. And I want to thank you very much for all your tremendous work, also your visionary leadership with the book of the New Cold War, and also the other books you have written about our relation with Russia. And I want to thank you very much that you joined Pax Europiana, and really for your time and also for your leadership. It's very much appreciated. Thanks a lot for joining the show.
Well, Gunther, thank you. Herzlichen Dank. Your questions are excellent, and I really appreciate your friendly presence on Twitter. And although we've never met in the flesh, I'm sure when we do meet, we will get on absolutely splendidly. And I look forward to continuing our friendship in real life.
Thanks a lot. I will stop recording now.